Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. In this episode, we interview Audrey Beard and Sonja Solomun, two representatives from the Coalition for Critical Technology.
Audrey Beard, whose pronouns are they and she, is a critical AI researcher who explores the politics of artificial intelligence systems from the perceptron to ResNet, and from the researcher to society. She's especially concerned about conceptions of ethics in the development of AI as socio-technical systems, as well as in classrooms, boardrooms, conference venues, and developers' offices. This year, they earned their master's in computer science at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Sonja Solomun, whose pronouns are she and her, works on the politics of media and technology, including the history of digital platforms, polarization, and on fair and accountable governance of technology. She is currently the research director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at McGill's Max Bell School of Public Policy. Sonja is finishing her PhD at the Department of Communication Studies at McGill University.
Audrey and Sonja co-founded the Coalition for Critical Technology along with NM Amadeo, Chelsea Barabas, Theo Dryer, and Beth Semel. The mission of the Coalition for Critical Technology is to work towards justice by resisting technologies that exacerbate inequality, reinforce racism, and support the carceral state. A few of the topics that we cover in this interview include: what is the Coalition for Critical Technology? What is the tech-to-prison pipeline? What should you know about algorithms that are being used in law enforcement contexts? How has academia historically facilitated systemic oppression through technology?
Now, before we share the interview, we wanted to set the scene and say a bit about why the case study we cover here with Audrey and Sonja is so important. On May 5th, 2020, a group of researchers out of Harrisburg University published a press release about a paper they wrote titled "A Deep Neural Network Model to Predict Criminality Using Image Processing." In their press release, the authors reported that the research was going to appear in the Springer Nature research book series titled "Transactions on Computational Science and Computational Intelligence." Now, fast forward to June 23rd. Dylan and I logged into our Twitter account and saw hundreds of people in the AI ethics community liking, retweeting, and sharing a tweet from a group called the Coalition for Critical Technology. The tweet said, quote, "Sign our letter to urge all publishers to refrain from feeding the hashtag tech-to-prison pipeline with physiognomy 2.0, end quote. The letter mentioned in the tweet linked to a Medium article addressed to Springer, asking them to rescind the paper from their upcoming publication and to stop publishing papers that contribute to the tech-to-prison pipeline. We'll unpack what that pipeline is during this interview.
And so after Jess and I looked up again what physiognomy was, we decided to support the cause and sign the letter. And then we also decided to get in touch with the authors of the letter to find out more about how we might be able to support their work to end the tech-to-prison pipeline and see if they would be willing to come on the show. We are so excited to share this interview with Audrey and Sonja, two representatives from the Coalition for Critical Technology, to tell us more about the mission of the coalition, the motivation behind its creation, and why all of this matters. We are here today with Audrey Beard and Sonja Solomun, who are founding members of the Coalition for Critical Technology. How are you both doing today?
Doing great, thanks. How about you?
Doing well. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today. I was wondering, before we get into your own personal stories and your journeys to being founding members of the Coalition, if you could talk a bit about what the Coalition for Critical Technology is for folks who may not be aware of you.
Yeah, we actually joke about this all the time, that this coalition is probably the best thing to come out of a rage tweet ever. Theo Dryer posted about this now infamous paper, which we'll try to refrain from mentioning if possible, and called for an open letter in May to corral against some of the claims made in the paper, namely that AI can predict criminality solely from pictures of faces, and very specifically without racial bias. And we all just started writing in a big Google Doc, and a bunch of other scholars and activists joined in, and it kind of coalesced into this amorphous affinity group that we call the Coalition for Critical Technology.
So now that we know what the coalition itself is, Audrey and Sonja, we would love to know how both of you happened upon this group or created this group, and what caused both of you to feel motivated to, or inspired, I guess, to join together. And Sonja, why don't we start off with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Audrey mentioned, it was just this kind of serendipitous moment on Twitter that evolved. But I think we all saw the paper and reacted to it in a similar way, which was that we were sort of tired from our own work in these respective spaces. We were tired of seeing this come up again and again, and these claims being circulated and justified despite repeated and long-standing work showing how harmful these claims are, and how they perpetuate injustice and cause real-world harm. And I think so that was really kind of the motivation to just start the work, and then it very quickly and sort of organically evolved from there into what it is.
I came on, again, like all of this originated on Twitter. For the past year or so, I've been grappling with what it is that my field is doing for the world and to the world, and how I am fitting into this. And I've been developing my own ideas about what we as computer scientists can do and what we as computer scientists have been doing. And I mean, this really popped up at a really fortuitous time. I was finishing up my master's degree, and I was full of rage, just as everybody else was in May. And I had the opportunity to work with some very brilliant people, and I was, I think, able to contribute in a meaningful way, which was something that I was really searching for in that moment, to work on something that felt like more than what is typically considered computer science research, I guess.
So let's get to specifics now. Dylan and I first heard about both of you and the coalition from this Medium post, Abolish the Tech to Prison Pipeline. So could one of you begin by just kind of explaining what that letter was, and maybe just a brief reminder of what Springer's original article was, and then we can dive into how that helped form the coalition.
Sure, yeah. So the letter, the Medium post you're referring to, which is this open letter that we wrote along with a number of other activists and tech workers and scholars, along with the core coalition members that you named earlier. And the letter was really an attempt to kind of intervene in this circular incentive structure that really generates and maintains carceral technology and their logics. So just to briefly pin back to the original paper, and I think it's important to just talk about kind of the more broad structural problems of claims like these, instead of the individual metrics or details of the paper or its authors. The paper claimed to predict criminality solely from facial images, with 80% accuracy and no racial bias. And so publishing really serves a key and crucial incentive here, which consists of naturalizing what has repeatedly been debunked and is decidedly racist kind of phrenology, about predicting criminality and facial features of criminality and things like this. And I think this kind of naturalizing work itself sort of reinforces the demand for tools or technologies that can then, accurately or efficiently, and I'm doing air quotes right now on a podcast, that can efficiently or accurately predict criminality, right? So it's kind of an insidious cycle, and I think you can intervene in different parts of the wheel, right? The development of carceral technology, the effect of certain surveillance technologies on vulnerable populations, the political economy of carceral technology. We just happen to intervene in the publishing incentives because we see it as a core obligation of rigorous academic evaluation and academic work.
Totally, and if I can elaborate on this a little bit and drill down into how this cycle plays out in machine learning, or ML, we're seeing recently this elevation of phrenology, which, as Sonja said, is a long debunked and racist pseudoscience. We're seeing it get elevated to the level of what we call ground truth, which is ML and data science practitioners' word for the knowledge that we base ML models off of. This practice of elevation naturalizes these like neo-phrenological claims and reinforce the carceral logics and ultimately entrench racism more deeply into not only our field, but society in general.
Can we talk a little bit more about what we mean by phrenology here? Because like in my, coming from a sociologist background, I think of something very specific, which is the measurement of skull shape in order to continue to further marginalize, especially in like the Enlightenment period. And I'm curious about how that plays out in this technology element. So if you could just unpack that like tech to prison pipeline a little bit more specifically, that would be, I think, helpful.
So we're sort of extending this term of phrenology into the space of AI and more specifically computer vision, which is what we're seeing more and more. In this case, we're seeing a sort of bioessentialism of race and sort of taking this socially constructed notion of race and of criminality and connecting them to very explicitly together through the fields of computer vision, data science, machine learning. And I would also extend this notion of like neo-phrenology to other sorts of biometric data. Y'all might have seen on Twitter a few days ago, there was a sort of proposal that was made famous coming out of Indiana that seeks to quantify the chances of recidivism based on things like heart rate and cortisol levels and these other like biological factors that really serve more than anything to make criminality a sort of biological trait, which of course from a scientific perspective, from a machine learning perspective, and from a sociological perspective is really flawed and really problematic because the notion of criminality is socially constructed. It's something that doesn't exist naturally. It is contingent on societal norms, and it's contingent on laws, and all of these, of course, are mediated through racism and mediated through imperialism and colonialism and xenophobia, and we're seeing this really get enshrined and lionized as sort of objective in the fields of machine learning, AI, data science.
I think just to expand on the category of criminality is itself racially biased, as Audrey just explained. So research of this nature and these kinds of accompanying claims to accuracy really rest on assumptions, default assumptions about data regarding criminal arrests or conviction serving as kind of reliable or neutral indicators of underlying criminal activity. And yet, like, several scholars have demonstrated that these records are far from neutral, right? They reflect historical court and arrest policies and practices of the criminal justice system, and who police choose to arrest, how judges choose to rule, which people are granted longer or more lenient sentences, right? So that's why we, in the letter, we really try to intervene in these like ground truth claims, rather than, is this a case of bad data, like dirty data? Is this a case of bad actors? Is this intentional malice on the part of the authors? And we maintain that it's not. It's a deeply embedded and structural problem that moves beyond individual bad actors or individual specifics, and try to look at the kind of longer problem here.
Some of the discourse that we've seen following this letter is sort of like, oh, how could this sort of thing happen? Like, clearly this is wrong. The institution of computer science or whatever has failed us. And I think that's something that we really tried to head off in the letter that maybe didn't quite come through. People are sort of taking this notion of like garbage in, garbage out, and expanding it a little bit. But we can't really solve these sorts of problems with more data or better data or like individualized fairness metrics, because ultimately it's not the data or the algorithm that is ultimately rotten. It's the entire criminal justice system that is founded on these racist ideas of criminality and the valuation of property over the valuation of people and human lives. Specifically, property owned by white people.
Getting back to this letter specifically that both of you contributed to and wrote for Springer, just to kind of like briefly summarize for the listeners in case anybody's having a hard time keeping or following along here. So we have this article that Springer publishes that is about how it's an AI model that can predict criminality by faces, and that is a way of basically saying that criminality is something that can be a biological trait within humans, which is a hugely racist claim. And so as the coalition, you all come together and you write this letter to Springer that now has 2,435 signatures backing it. So what were the goals of this letter? What were you all hoping to get out of writing this letter and sending it to Springer?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I will start by, I can hear people criticizing on Twitter already. Springer had not officially published. It was a press release on a specific university's website saying that it would be published. And so I just want to make that clear for the people who will defend Springer until the day that they die. But I'd say that the goal of this letter was an attempt to start to dismantle the power structures and resist the complicity within them by undertaking a sort of very specific directed intervention in this cycle that Sonja and I both sort of mentioned. And you can read a little bit more about it on our website, forcritical.tech, for anybody who wants to check it out.
We asked Springer we made three main requests, and none of them have been fully met yet. So we asked that Springer refrain from publishing this piece, which they quickly but vaguely agreed to just on Twitter. We asked that they refrain from publishing this article and to explain publicly why, which has not happened. We also asked that Springer should publicly acknowledge their role in kind of propping up and circulating these kinds of claims and this debunked pseudoscience. And we asked that publishers in general refrain from publishing this work that is extremely problematic, right? Like this kind of work legitimizes and perpetuates real world harm, and with severe consequences. We saw a recent case of a wrongful arrest using certain this is a matter of life and death for vulnerable populations, and so it has to be considered according to very rigorous and high stakes evaluation metrics.
And I'm curious about what responses you got originally to that open letter, because as Jess said, you have thousands of people who have signed on to it. But I am curious about maybe the opposite side as well. Like, did you get a fair amount of pushback? Did Springer respond? And then what was kind of like, what is the state of it now?
Generally speaking, we were very blown away by how positive the reactions were. We had very few people who were defending it, which maybe it just didn't get picked up by the right alt-right media or whatever. But most of the negative discourse, I would say, was just misconstruing it as a single bad apple study or whatever. And we tried not to engage with that sort of logic there, because ultimately we can go miles and miles down into that rabbit hole and really get nowhere. But some of the other responses that we saw were a lot of, for instance, like senior academics particularly, or people high up in industry, might have been hesitant to sign their name on because they hadn't seen the letter, or because they thought that possibly the claims could be valid under certain circumstances. And quite honestly, that was pretty disappointing to see people still sort of latching on to this techno-optimist kind of perspective, without really understanding how deeply rooted these problems actually are. Largely though that blowback came from computer scientists, and same with the Bad Apples study. Of the folks who ultimately responded to the letter, it was a pretty mixed bag. A lot of, as you might imagine, the radical folks in like quote unquote ethics of AI. We saw a lot of people signing on from sociology, anthropology, history, and a lot of law scholars as well. And then, of course, tech workers and journalists who cover tech, who might not necessarily be in the academy, but are certainly adjacent. As well as some prominent machine learning researchers, some of whom have pretty problematic histories of their own. I would say the most surprising and kind of heartening response was we saw at least one person who had done work like this in the past and didn't actually understand in the moment why this was problematic, and why what sort of narrative that work sort of fits into, but they sort of repented, which was really interesting, and I think an indication that we had done something right, that we had built this sort of, one of the things that we're trying to do is build a coalition across disciplines and across industry and academia, and seeing somebody who had benefited from this type of work come out and say, yeah, I messed up. This is actually really problematic, and I've contributed to it. That was really powerful. And ultimately, if that's the only thing that we accomplish, that we, shake a few people out of that cycle of just perpetuating it, then I'd say that the letter was in some regards a success.
And this letter is kind of symbolic of the start of a movement. At least this is something we've all spoken offline about before. And so let's kind of dive into what this letter symbolizes and represents and what it's hopefully leading us and also the coalition towards. And it's this notion of academia facilitating oppressive technology, right? So what is that? What does that actually mean? And how is that being enacted in today's day and age?
I think academia, like any other side of work, I know it's uncommon for some people to think of academics as workers, but we are, and we have obligations to our communities. Academia participates in this kind of like co-production of race and technology, and there are ample fields, my own included, where tech fixes for social problems are not only common practice, but they're really venerated and seen as innovative and socially benevolent, right? And look, in many areas they can be, but that's precisely why we need to keep asking how the technology will be used and what assumptions are required for it to work. Your point about oppressive technology, I think it really thrives under this veneer of objectivity or neutrality, and under a lack of reflexivity. And I think there's definitely clear incentives for building and supporting these kinds of claims using technology. Tech is like this affordable and efficient way to do policing and surveillance work. And we see this in so many examples. Companies like Palantir, who've built some of the most insidious and sort of opaque mass surveillance tools, offer up their services to government for free. And we're seeing this in Canada and globally with facial recognition systems and moratoriums on their use. And so that's a huge part of the kind of techlash that you're describing right now. I think to answer the other question about what does it maybe symbolize, I think that this kind of veneer of tech solutionism is beginning to crack, or rather we're seeing pockets of ruptures. And it's really led by community organizations. Here I'm thinking of the work of Data for Black Lives, our data bodies, the carceral technology resistance network. And a lot of it has coalesced specifically around facial recognition and surveillance, and fantastic work there by the Detroit Community Technology Project, Algorithmic Justice League, Fight for the Future, and others. So I think it symbolizes attempts to strengthen academic and tech worker alliances as well, and hopefully that's something that continues to grow. We kind of joke about like 2020 being the year of open letters. Audrey, do you want to?
Yeah. This is something that we've seen a lot, right? There was the group of mathematicians who had sort of come together to make a similar statement. Of course, we saw that garbage Harper's letter, and we recognize that open letters are certainly not going to change the world, right? Anybody who thinks that is deluding themselves. But we think that it represents a sort of, it's indicative of these organic clusters of institutional and extra institutional mobilizing sort of pop up here and there. Sonja called them ruptures, and I think that's really appropriate to say. We think that capitalizing on this sort of energy that people are feeling is a potential vector for building what we're calling infrastructures of resistance, which is something that we're working on right now through our coalition in trying to build a stronger resistance network to combat this morally reprehensible technologies.
We hear that a lot in our interviews with folks about there's something different happening right now. There's some people are seeing these systems in a different way. Part of that is there's more social scientists being involved in the conversation. Part of that is just things that have happened in our world, the murder of George Floyd, and beyond, everything that's been going on in our world. And there's still this question of the how, right? So we are angry, we are frustrated, and there are a lot of folks out there who are looking to do something. And it sounds like you all are kind of on to a particular way of doing something. And I wonder if you could say more about what it looks like, in a day-to-day way of how you build those infrastructures of resistance or pockets of resistance towards creating justice and equity in these systems that are just so immense and complex.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Like, how do we do this? It's really hard. And Audre Lorde talked about how hard it is to dismantle power structures using tools within those power structures. She talked about this back in the 80s. I think the answer is really different for each of those groups, and I'll sort of address each of those and then talk about how we sort of fit in there. So within the academy, for instance, individual students or individual workers have almost zero power, right? Because a lot of academia views students as customers, and staff and faculty are really workers, employees for the university, including grad students, I will say. So ultimately, each of us collectively have this enormous power to resist this sort of work. In a lot of ways, students and grad students, undergrads, faculty members, and staff members can gain a lot by emulating worker unions. Something that we're starting to see a lot happening in, for instance, like tech workers. The Tech Workers Coalition strikes me as one in particular. I was involved in some work like this, a grassroots effort at my school, Rensselaer, to do this kind of organizing, and I've seen it do a lot of good, of mobilizing students around a single cause or a series of causes that ultimately impact each of us in different ways. But I'll say that educators and other academics play a role here. So they shape the discourse in these spaces. You hear in politics a lot of like the Overton window, and I think I'll draw on that a little bit by having different conversations and asking different questions in our classrooms and in our labs. We have the power to make our politics explicit in pedagogy, because no matter what we're doing political work, right? I mean, the insistence that we're not doing political work is in fact political, right? You're maintaining the status quo here. But by being explicit and saying, no, this is how the work that we're doing is political, and this is the sort of political work that we are doing, I think that we can really shape how students and how researchers view their work from a social perspective. Ways that we are trying to do this sort of individually and as a coalition is by drawing on work done by community activists and by folks from all sorts of different like radical philosophical and political ideologies to sort of bring into our spaces, because as I said earlier, it's not as if these spaces aren't political whatsoever, right? Computer science is very deeply political, and by shifting how we relate to each other, how we relate to our work, and how we relate to those who ultimately downstream are reacting to it and being affected by it, we can actually do some work here. It certainly doesn't stop at like intellectualizing and doing research or reading. Certainly, there's no substitute for more direct engagement or on the ground mobilizing and sort of deferring to people who, like our elders in this space, who have been working on this type of these types of struggles for years. But I think one thing that we're trying to bring to this and that we're seeing more and more is people allowing activism into the academy and letting the academy prop up activism. And I think that's ultimately what we can do collectively that would be most effective to lend support to these struggles that have been going on for centuries.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. I think interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinary work, interdisciplinarity is a term that gets thrown around a lot in academia, but it's so critical and crucial for AI. One of the projects we do for instance, I'm just thinking one of the projects we have at the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy at McGill, we really try and do this work, and it's tough, right? We have a project called Tech-Informed Policy, and we do these tech-informed policy briefs, and just working with writing collaboratively with computer scientists and machine learning students, you realize quickly how limiting speaking different kind of disciplinary languages is. And if we think of, the definition of radical as kind of excavating these unlikely connections, then the tough work of cross-disciplinarity that is reflexive and care-focused is radical work. And I think the possibility for that can be found everywhere. And I think too, just sort of working to demystify AI and just kind of grounding it in its historical context is important. Especially if we understand AI as a kind of particular affordance of power. Sure, the scale and kind of the monopoly of big tech is revolutionary, but it's not historically unprecedented, and I think that's important.
I want to sort of riff off that for a moment. Sonja mentioned that interdisciplinarity is hard, and I think that bears repeating. It's not just hard from the perspective of sociologists and humanists. For computer scientists who find ourselves at the border between computer science and humanistic inquiry, it's really difficult. And I've talked about this on Twitter and more recently at 4Us, that ultimately it can be really traumatizing to try to do this work, because it's not an individualistic, that you can't have an individualistic solution to a structural problem. And as much as we would like to intervene as much as we can, and I think we should, it's something that ultimately we collectively need to address. And so I'm thinking about particularly very precarious workers here. So like grad student workers, Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, queer, trans folks. Intersections of that precarity make it very difficult to do this. Make it very difficult to do this interdisciplinary work, especially when the entire structure is designed to cordon off disciplines into different schools, into different buildings, into different campuses, and often totally different institutions. I think that's something that we need to grapple with, and that's something that faculty members and advisors need to take a lot of work to sort of ameliorate. Educators have a lot of power here, and they need to support us in trying to do that work.
So you've both said the $1 million word at different points here. You've both said radical. You've said, power, uprooting systems of oppression. Sonja, you had kind of a brief description or definition of radical from your perspective too. So Sonja, could you just quickly define how you view the word radical as it relates to AI technology, and then maybe explain a bit as to whether or not you think that the coalition's work fits within that definition?
Audrey defined radical as this kind of fundamental reimagining, and I'll let her expand on that a little bit. But I think that's so key here. It reminds me of Rua Benjamin, who you've had on the show and whose work is so fantastic. She talks about imagination as a contested field of action, right? And I think about that a lot. I think about how the most precarious groups in our society, don't have this luxury of reimagining futures. And, Rua talks about how many of us live in other people's imaginations, right? So I think for me, the term radical really evades kind of a fixed definition. I think of it more as like a process or a verb. I would define it as shoring up or finding unlikely connections. And by that definition, I think the coalition's work is radical, although I'm not sure if everyone would find it as such.
Yeah, so Sonja mentioned radical. My definition of radical here being a sort of like fundamental reimagining of our constructed reality, because it is constructed, based on critical inquiry, both internal and external. And so I think that the word radical does a lot of work here in a lot of different contexts, right? And it serves different purposes, and it lends power in some spaces and removes power in other spaces. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I also think that it's in spaces where it is powerful, it is likely or liable at least to be co-opted, and in spaces where it's not powerful, where it's actually like problematic, is we'll see it being weaponized to sort of blur the lines between different types of engagements. And we can debate over who is radical and who is not, and I'm sure a lot of people would call me radical. I'm thinking of a lot of people in computer science, but also a lot of people probably would not call us or our work radical. An insurrectionary anarchist would certainly not call what we do radical. And I think, to Sonja's point, it is something that we are doing. We are doing this reimagining, this critical inquiry, and in context that can be the sort of work that we're doing, writing and coalition building. But we're seeing it on the ground. We're seeing it in people who are resisting police brutality. We're seeing it in people who are resisting capitalistic social relations. We're seeing it in people who are resisting colonialism. And so I think any just conception of radical or radicalism needs to acknowledge the deep history of the term and of radical thought and action, while also recognizing that it really does mean and do different things in different places.
As we move towards closing, I was wondering if you both would be willing to share both final thoughts that you may have and also your vision for the coalition going forward. Maybe, in like 5 years, what are your like grandest aspirations for where this coalition can go?
I think that the most important thing that I drew out of this entire process of writing the letter and forming the coalition is that our work is never done. Our work is the process. It's the process of taking care of each other. It's the process of doing justice and acting in ethical ways towards the connections and the relationships that we have. And I'm drawing on a very specific, like, sort of philosophical thought here of building relationships and gaining gaining sort of like freedom and power through our connections, our ability to affect other people and be affected by other people. And sort of to that end, I think a success, 5 years down the line, I think a success for the coalition would be a strong group of people. And group, I don't think that the coalition as an institution or organization is a particularly important thing for me, but really the affinity that we're cultivating among different people. That's really what our next project is focusing on, that I'm sure everybody will kind of see later. But to that end, I think that I would love to see the ability to support our collaborators, not just in like a caring way, the way that we, I think, do right now, but also materially support our collaborators. I mean, I can't tell you how much work the letter was. I think all of us were treating it as a 20-hour-a-week job for 5 weeks, and that's certainly not sustainable. But if we can ultimately support our collaborators through grants or through fellowships or what have you, I think that would be really powerful. Sort of disengaging ourselves from the institution, while still relying on the institution of, the industrial academic apparatus, I suppose. But really like building solidarity among different people and being able to build a sort of autonomy in this way. That's what I would call a success in 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition. Maybe just closing thoughts. I think at the end of the day, we need to kind of collectively reclaim the problems that AI and other tech is like marketed to solve. And so many scholars and so many, folks in this space and so many folks who you've had on the show have demonstrated repeatedly how attempts to, eliminate race or discrimination actually perpetuate racism and cause real world harm. So I think reclaiming those problems is a powerful and radical, dare I say, move.
And for folks who want to be involved with the coalition going forward, or who want to find out more about you two as individual researchers, where can folks go to get more information or to connect?
So you can always go to forcritical.tech. That's our very rudimentary website right now. That has information on each of us, and it has links to our work that we've done, both this Medium post and then also like a PDF if you want to include it in, say, a syllabus. Feel free to cite us. And you can always email us at coalitionforcriticaltechnology@gmail.com.
And we'll be sure to include all of that and more resources in the show notes page. But for now, Audrey, Sonja, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us a bit about your story and the Coalition for Critical Technology.
We want to thank Sonja and Audrey again for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. And Jess, let's throw it to you first. What did you think about this conversation? What stood out to you, and what do you want to talk about?
Well, there's a lot of this conversation that really hit close to home for me, especially Audrey's comments, because both Audrey and I are computer scientists. And so I think that we've been surrounded by similar communities when we've been really interested in ethics, especially. And so this is something that I talked about in our recent episode with Anima Anandkumar, and just some of the trials and tribulations of being interested and being an advocate, a public advocate for ethics within the tech community, and within especially the computer science community as a computer scientist. And so for me, I think one of the comments that Audrey said that really stuck out to me was how we as researchers, especially as technical researchers, have this duty and this responsibility to think about the social implications of our research before we begin the research. And so something that I see come up a lot, actually, especially in the computer science research community, is that there's a lot of potential research that sounds like it could be really interesting. So I'm talking about algorithms that can predict gender from faces. There was an algorithm recently that came out that could predict BMI from images that it pulled from, I think, a Weight Watchers data set, and predicting criminality from people's faces, like we saw in the paper from this interview. And these seem like they could be really interesting algorithms to create, and it seems like they could solve really interesting problems, but it's much more important to think about the impacts of this work than it is to just dive into creating these algorithms without thinking about the ethical impacts and the consequences on real people through the creation of these technologies.
Well, let's stick with that for a second. Like, why do you think that people think these things are good ideas in the first place? So in the case of this paper, right, this paper that was titled "A Deep Neural Network Model to Predict Criminality Using Image Processing," I feel like it's easy on our side of being able to claim like the ethical high ground, where I feel like it is kind of pretty easy to see the where this can end up, right, and just how much of a slippery slope this is in terms of reinforcing racial bias and stereotypes and already oppressive systems of criminality. But if I take a step back from kind of like what I know around that, and I try to put my mind in the place of these people who are writing this paper, like from both of our ends as like researchers, I think it's important for us to ask, like, something seems so obvious to us. Why is it not seeming obvious to other people? So for you, Jess, why do you think that people do this? Is it just because these are interesting questions? Is it just because, like, maybe as engineers or even as academics, we're just trained to ask interesting questions without thinking about the consequences of our research or of our actions or design choices? Or is it something else?
I wouldn't even say it's because we're academics. I think it's because we're human. We're very curious creatures. We're kind of like cats in that way. And I think that, the first thing that comes to my mind is computer scientists aren't educated, at least not commonly, to think about the consequences of the questions that they're asking and the algorithms that they're writing. And this is something I experienced. I told a little bit of my story in the very first episode that we came out with, but I literally learned in my very first data science class how to scrape the web and pretty much any website from the web that doesn't have an openly accessible API. So even websites that you're not really allowed to scrape. I learned how to do that in my first data science class without any mention of the ethics of doing this. And at the same time, I was lucky because I was taking a computer ethics class, and I learned at the same time that that's not okay and that I should really watch when I do that, where I do that, and the impacts of doing that. But I was lucky that I was in that computer ethics class. And I think a lot of computer scientists don't have both sides of the coin when they are being trained to do what they do as computer scientists. And I don't think this is anyone's fault necessarily. This is just the system that we currently live in. And so I don't think that it is a computer scientist's fault or it makes a computer scientist immoral in any way to ask interesting questions and want to find interesting results. I do the same thing all the time. But I think now we have to ask ourselves, what do we do to educate computer scientists and to change the field of computer science so that we are asking these questions of consequence and risk before even thinking about designing an algorithm?
Sure. And again, like I generally do like push back a little bit because I do think that what you said at the beginning is right on, which is like, although computer scientists, at least right now in our history, may be uniquely positioned to cause particular harm because of the fact that, 50 engineers in Silicon Valley can impact 2 billion people in a way that was never really the case before right now. I do think that it is a uniquely, human problem. It's not just in that computer science space, even if there's a particular, I guess, focus for us on that because of this podcast and things like that. But I think that in general, that question of intentionality and the question of if, what is the impact of what we do in the world. How do our actions impact other people is something that we're not necessarily socialized to think about. I think across the board, honestly, and obviously there are some exceptions to that rule. But I know that like empathy isn't like taught in elementary school, right? It's not like math, science, you do a little bit of algebra and then you do a little bit of empathy work, right?
I wish.
There's different things that we prioritize, right, in that space. But all of this, I think, gets back to the question of this particular case study, which for me is who has the responsibility to shape the narrative around these topics. So as much as Audrey and Sonja and the coalition were calling into accountability the authors of this article, they were also very much calling into accountability the editors over at Springer. And I think that is just such an important part to piece out in the story of these are this like massive systems, and there's a lot of people that do actually have agency in the story who we may not always think about as the people that need to be held accountable. But really, like, it's across the board. It's not just the engineers. It's not just the people who are looking to publish these studies, although they need to be held accountable too. It's also the people who are publishing the studies, the people who are sharing the studies, the people who are then making those studies into technology, who are strategizing around them, the HR and PR departments. Like, we're all culpable to this in a certain degree, especially if we have power or agency in these systems for sharing really sharing any of this across the board. And I think, again, that's a human problem, and it's a problem that we need to look at in a holistic and a macro way.
Yeah, well, maybe this is the point in this episode where we now break the fourth wall and we say, you, listener, whoever you are, whatever position you're in, if you are a researcher, if you are a coder, an engineer, if you are sitting on the editorial board of Springer, if you are involved in academia or the tech industry in any way, you are in a position to be asking yourself what the risks are of the questions that you're asking and the technologies you're creating and the potential systems of oppression that you are enabling. So it is up to all of us to figure out where we are uniquely situated to do something about this and to stop sitting still and being quiet.
Just before we sign off, listeners probably don't know since they weren't with us when we were right before recording this, but you were showing me this set of pictures about this island in Japan with all these cats. And earlier when you, so just like just picture an island with hundreds of cats. Go look it up. It's great. When you were talking earlier about how like curiosity is like a very human thing and we're all kind of like cats, I kind of got that image. And I started thinking about like, even if we are a bunch of curious cats just kind of on this island, we call Earth or whatever, that it doesn't absolve us of our culpability, right? Like curiosity is a beautiful thing and creativity is a beautiful thing, but there needs to be a level of intentionality to that curiosity. Anyway, that's my image that I'm bringing out of this. Do you have any thoughts on that image of cats, Jess, and how it might impact our carceral systems?
I think you said it all. You summed it up. For more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
You really don't want to engage with the cat
I
thing,
didn't know what to say. I love it. You said it well.
And if you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod, and as always,
stay radical. And for those who are curious about this cat island, it is called Aoshima. That's spelled Aoshima. Go look it up.
We'll make sure to include it at the very, very end of the show notes because it has very little to do with the very serious topic of today's
Yeah, but
episode.
Seriously, go look this up if you just want to feel good. If the world's getting you down, there's a lot of cats on this island.